You're watching Reality Check. Today's growth numbers were supposed to give us the first official statistical confirmation of what all of us, millions of Indians, ordinary and not so ordinary, have experienced, that the economy is in a severe crisis, worsened by the onset of a pandemic. In some ways, India is at the worst of both worlds, at the center of a very deeply worrying X. And let's put that X up on the screen to explain what exactly we mean. The X is this, that as the graph of the coronavirus rises ever higher in India, crossing the 3.6 million mark, as you can see by the graph that is going up at 36.2 lakhs, growth has fallen from 3.1% at the beginning of the pandemic. It is now down to almost 24% for the first quarter compared to the first quarter of last year. That's the worrying X at the middle of which India finds itself. And there's no better representation of how growth has fallen quarter by quarter than this next slide that we're about to present to you. That from a slide where it was gradually coming down, and remember that these sliding numbers predate the pandemic, to now a full-fledged crash of almost 24%. Every single major sector of the economy has been hit. And let's put that up on the screen for you to give you an idea. All in the negative. Construction, the worst hit at 50%. Trade and hotels almost the same at almost 50%. Manufacturing at almost 40%, mining and quarrying down 23%, public administration down 10%, electricity and other utilities down 7%, financial services and real estate down 5%. The only silver lining is agriculture, which despite the pandemic and also helped by a good monsoon is up by 3.5%. That's the state of the Indian economy. Now, before we go to panel, let me just start first with Thomas Isaac, Minister of Finance from Kerala. Now, I spoke to him earlier and I began by asking him, Mr. Isaac, that the Finance Minister at a meeting where she was trying to justify why she couldn't pay the states their dues, she described the crash or the looming crash in the economy as an act of God. Now, when you look at these numbers, do you accept that explanation or do you think there's an element of political mismanagement?
These are silly ways of approaching this problem. Now, she admits that the GDP is contracting. We are facing the sharpest recession in the history of India. Now, how do you address this? By cutting government expenditure? That's what I call silly. Every macroeconomic test will tell you the government will have to increase the expenditure to keep up the aggregate demand. And central government is also trying to do it through the stimulus packages and so on, even though I do have reservations on them. But this same government is compelling the states to cut expenditure because not fully compensating the loss of revenue would be tantamount to cutting the expenditure. I have already budgeted for this revenue in my budget. So it makes no economic sense. You don't approach this problem whether it is act of God, act of nature, act of man, or normal action. These are silly way of approaching it.
Okay.
Macroeconomic approach should be to look at the total GDP.
Right.
Yes.
Now, yes. No, because, okay, silly ways, that's strong language, but what would you make of the argument by the government, by the finance minister, that they don't have enough money to pay all of you or to spend?
So if I say that, it has some meaning because I cannot print notes, say borrow from the Reserve Bank. I have no assets to sell. I cannot borrow without the permission of center. But what is the constraint of center? Look at the pump priming being done, all the developed countries. India is an emerging economy. I do agree with her that central government does not have sufficient revenue. The income tax is going to fall, the corporate tax is going to go down, all their own making, because they have given such big concessions. Therefore, but nevertheless, I accept that. What is preventing them to borrow? But they may be arguing that the fiscal deficit will go up, rating agencies will take a run on India and so on.
Yes.
Look, you borrow from the Reserve Bank, monetize your debt. It does not affect your fiscal deficit. Why can't they do that? And that's what all the countries in the world are doing.
Okay.
What are we so special?
But so you're saying don't worry, that if you are going to, when you say monetize debt, that's another way of saying print cash or borrow heavily. You're saying don't worry about the fact that you'll be downgraded to junk status or whatever it is?
They will have to downgrade the entire world here. See, tell me which country is sticking to this fiscal deficit rules. Now take IMF, the most conservative institution. But do you know what is the suggestion? They want to print money. They want to create new SDRs to be freely distributed to the world. I don't know why India voted against that. But the whole approach of everyone in the world, including IMF, has changed, but not India government. Right. They want to cut the revenues of the state governments. They want to, the expenditure is squeezed. I think this is the surest and simplest way of ensuring that recession will get deeper, and next quarter will see even more sharper plunge of our GDP.
Okay, so describe to us in material terms, because you're finance minister, what is this crunch in revenue already doing to your own state and to what you're able to spend on and not spend on?
Well, our revenues, I think, will be below the budgeted amount by 30 to 40%. 30% for sure. Now, how do you fill this gap? Now, what we have done so far is we have front-loaded all our borrowing. We have not been sitting and thinking too anxious about what would happen in future if our borrowing is exhausted. We have front-loaded our borrowing, provided relief to the people, transferred income to them, spruced up our health sector, and it's shown, it gets reflected the way we have been containing COVID spread. We have the lowest fatality not only in the country, in world at large. Now what is going to happen? If you don't have money, we will be forced to cut even the health expenditure. We will be forced to cut the welfare payments to people, let alone our developmental activities and so on. So this will have a disastrous consequence for the welfare of the people in Kerala.
Strong words there from you, Thomas Isaac. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. We also have on the show with us Nilesh Shah, who's a part-time member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, also Managing Director of Kotak Mahindra Asset Management Limited. We have Niranjan Harandandani, who is President of Naredco and Asocham, the Chambers of Commerce, also a leading player in the real estate sector. Jayati Ghosh, Professor of Economics at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at JNU, and Praveen Chakravarti, Chairperson, Technology and Data Cell at the Indian National Congress. Nilesha, you saw, or you heard rather, perhaps Thomas Isaac there, Finance Minister of Kerala. He was saying that this crash is not an act of God. There's an element of mismanagement. Do you agree? And if so, what do you think that behind these terrible numbers is the element of political or governance mismanagement?
See, it's always easy for opposition to blame that ruling party has made a mistake. And when the role reverses, the statement continues to remain the same. Clearly, there has been COVID-19 related effect all over the world. Japan, despite giving 3 times more stimulus than India, has witnessed higher negative GDP growth. US, despite giving 2 times more fiscal stimulus than India, has witnessed higher negative GDP growth. I'll rather focus on solution. Undoubtedly, there is impact on demand. It's not as much a supply constraint as it is a demand constraint. And clearly, we need to put money in the pockets of consumers and provide relief to the borrowers. So that in the subsequent quarters, second, third, and fourth quarter, the economy can get back to its own momentum.
Okay, but
now,
yeah.
If you can give just me 1 minute, how do we raise resources without getting downgraded by rating agency? Clearly, rating agencies have different rules for developed nations versus developing nations. And the best opportunity for us is to raise resources through monetization of assets. 3 simple solutions. 1, there is more than 100,000 crore lying in custodian of enemy property. Best time to monetize is today. You can get about $13 billion. Second, divestment of public sector enterprises in a market manner has brought down their valuation to almost 2008 level. Can we pursue the path of strategic divestment so that supply fear goes away from the market? This PSUs, if they start trading at last 10 years high valuation, that's an income of roughly about $100 billion in appreciation in PSU. And finally, my favorite topic is gold. You have about $2 trillion worth of gold, mostly lying in unaccounted form. Please bring them into formal economy. Even if you target 10%, that's $200 billion.
You had mentioned that last time as well. I was only intervening about the point where you said that other countries have performed worse. I don't have the data for Japan, but the data that we had based on OECD indicated that India was the worst in terms of the crash at 24%. Spain was 22%.
Japan was 27.8% drop in GDP on second quarter on a fiscal stimulus of 21.1%.
So Japan may have been worse, but in our numbers, the US is not worse. US is only down 9.1% for the quarter ended 30th June 2020.
Interpretation error. They are down 32.9% on a fiscal stimulus of 13%. One is a quarter-on-quarter comparison. Second is a year-on-year comparison.
I see. Okay. Ours was, I think, looking at quarter. But anyway, leaving that aside, Jayati Ghosh, do you accept this argument that it's easy to criticize the government, everyone's in a mess?
I think we have to appreciate that this is actually the worst economic crisis we've had since independence. We have never been in a situation of this extreme crisis, and I would say catastrophe. And, you know, this argument about Japan is a little worse than us, and this is meaningless. We are among the G20 countries, the worst performer. Even in South Asia, we're among the worst. But what is particularly alarming, I would argue, in India, is that it's not just that this is a 24% decline, but in all likelihood, it will be a deeper decline once we actually get the figures for unorganized activities. As you know, these early numbers are always based only on the formal or registered sector, and we don't capture the extent of decline in informal activities. This happened also in demonetization and elsewhere. So the likely situation is that it's even worse. But consider the sectors that have declined the most. Construction down by half. A whole bunch of retail, trade, hospitality, etc. Transport down by 47%. Manufacturing 40%. All the employment-intensive sectors massively declining. And the worst of all is that government spending has declined by 10%. So what stimulus are we talking about? The negative stimulus of the government. It's not a positive stimulus.
Niranjan Hirandandani, to that point, and especially construction, where you are, down 50%, the entire sort of rhetoric was that we have injected this 20 lakh crore package, etc., etc. Why, despite that, are things so bad? What's gone wrong?
I think the impetus from the government has been on the supply side. So I think there is a lot missing on the demand side creation that is not happening. Number one, I take what Nilesh Shah has said, and I think we need to push those items which he's talking about. But I'd like to add 2 or 3 things more to it. Number one, I think the road construction, building construction, highway construction,
Yes.
those have all slowed down. They need to be actually 2x or 3x the number that is there. Every country in the world which has gone through unemployment and or depression of the
Yes.
kind that we are seeing today
Yes.
have always focused on construction and real estate development. So if you
Okay.
look at what happened in Germany during the depression, the autobahns were not for the cars, but they were actually for the recession. Similarly, when you wanted a double-digit GDP growth in China,
Right.
it was not only manufacturing which has done it. It is
Okay.
actually construction, real estate, and development which is there. So we need to put in far more money into these sectors, which is one. Number
Okay.
two,
Yes.
the demand side has not been taken care of. We do need a cut in GST in order to trigger demand. Yesterday, Maharashtra government has reduced stamp duty from 5% to 2% up to
Okay.
December and 3%. This is the first moment of the demand side triggering of the real estate industry.
Okay.
But we need much more on that sector.
Okay. Praveen Chakravarti, for all of this, if one wants to do heavy labor-intensive government or state-driven activity like road construction and so on, you need money. You heard what Thomas Isaac said, Chief Minister, I beg your pardon, Finance Minister of Kerala, that don't worry about being downgraded, either print money, borrow heavily, but is that realistic, or is that just the view of something that you can say comfortably when you're in opposition?
Sure. So before I answer that question, let me just try and set some context here. I think today is actually, in some sense, a very sad and an extraordinary day. First, we lost one of India's finest politicians, Mr. Pranab Mukherjee. The Chinese opened a fresh set of aggressive tactics near the border. We have the highest number of daily coronavirus cases, and we have the worst economic contraction in independent India's history. So we are living in extraordinary times. We must understand and we must kind of somewhat recognize that. The second part is, I think there was an earlier discussion about an act of God, as alluded to by the finance minister.
Yes.
I think the finance minister is right, but then on the reverse, I would argue. She must actually thank the act of God, only the act of the rain gods, because if not for that, if agriculture had also been in the negative territory, we would have definitely been worse than Japan and all these other countries that you were talking about. So it's really, we must thank the act of the rain god. Now, coming to where will we find the resources from? We see, considering we live in extraordinary times, yes, heavy borrowing is inevitable. Now, first, I think in an article that I had written along with the former Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, we had elaborated a few steps. We said, first, try and get money from multilateral institutions. India's track record as an international borrower, whenever was needed, is impeccable. So we have.
You mean from IMF and World Bank and so on?
IMF, World Bank, and all of that. That's the first step. Yes, it is not enough, but let's first get there. Second, borrow from the market. Borrow from the domestic market, dip into the domestic savings pool. Yes, it will increase interest rates for others. Yes, it will crowd out private sector, but we are living in extraordinary times. Third, then, if required, do get the RBI to monetize deficit or colloquially called print money. There is a way to get resources. We will have to go through these steps, and we cannot shy of these.
Nilesh, I have very little time left. Do you think India should print money?
I don't think so. We need to print more money. We need to focus on improving the velocity of money.
Okay.
And if velocity of money improves, credit creation itself will create money. and then the objective which Praveen bhai mentioned will get automatically achieved. So instead of focusing on just throwing money, let's focus also on creating velocity of money.
Velocity of money. Okay, I'm not sure I fully understand. Jayati Ghosh, last word.
If I may,
basically, if you do not borrow from the Reserve Bank, which is to say have a monetized deficit and spend lots more now, you will end up with a larger fiscal deficit because the economy will tank more, your tax revenues will fall even further, and even as you cut spending, you will end up with a larger fiscal deficit. So the right thing to do right now is to borrow from the Reserve Bank, monetize your deficit, spend. That will generate incomes. Those people will go out and spend. You will have positive multiplier effects. That's what he means, I think, by the velocity of money. Those positive multiplier effects will generate more activity. You will get more tax revenues over time. You will actually prevent the economy from tanking even further.
Okay, do I have 10 seconds? I know Praveen wants to come in. Can I, Praveen, I'm told 10 seconds is all we have.
No, I just wanted to respond to Mr. Nilesh Shah's suggestions. See, I think the gold, redemption and divestment are good ideas, but perhaps not in current times. What we need is immediate boosts to the economy. Those things will take time. Those are new schemes. So we cannot wait, I'm afraid, for those ideas. Now is not the time to experiment with those ideas.
All right. Okay. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you all so much for joining us and also for watching. That's all the time we have on Reality Check. Thanks for watching. Good night.